What's up guys, Asian here again with another Build Basics video. Today we're going to be going over damage mitigation. So this is going to be a little bit different compared to our resistances video. In that video we explained just what physical and spell resistance are. In this video we're actually going to be going over the entire damage mitigation formula in its entirety. So we'll be talking about sources of mitigation, as well as how mitigation actually works for PvE content. So this is a post on the official forums by Luna, who I believe is the tank for Accidental Aggro, I believe, or she plays on PCNA. They have done pretty much all the calculations necessary for damage mitigation. So without further ado, let's go ahead and start talking about how it all works. So damage mitigation, in a nutshell, is basically 100 minus, so this entire term here, you can see here, the resistance is divided by 662. And then divide that entire thing by 100 in order to get a percentage, and then that's subtracted from 1 in order to get the actual mitigation. So if your resistances are, say, 6620, divide that by 662, you get 10. 10 divided by 100 is 0.1, so that is that entire thing, 0.1. And then 1 minus 0.1 is 0.9, 100 times 0.9 is 90, and then 100 minus 90 is 10, so you would be mitigating 10% of the damage incoming. And then you have these remaining formulas, so times 1 minus mitigation source 1 divided by 100, times 1 minus mitigation source 2 divided by 100, and so on and so forth. So basically what this means is that mitigation is all entirely multiplicative. So any sort of source of damage mitigation, therefore, doesn't really matter where it comes from. Doesn't matter where you place it on the equation. They pretty much are all going to be the same, no matter if you put one mitigation source before the next. So basically, that's how mitigation works. So you can see here that the amount of resistances to 1% mitigation, according to this, is about 662. Most people just round down to 660. So that's just because the cap is around 33,000. And so damage taken is going to be your base damage, basically times this mitigation factor here. So you can see here that this second half here is pretty much that mitigation, except instead of 100 times minus 100 times, you're just getting rid of this, so that way you have base damage times this entire term here. So basically, more or less, that's how mitigation works. So now let's talk about where you can get sources of mitigation. So obviously, resistances is the first place to get it. Now, there are other places that you can get mitigation from. So the big one is going to be blocking. Blocking has basically 50% additional mitigation. So if you block something that does 10k damage, you reduce that by 50%. Doesn't matter if you're a tank, a healer, or a DPS, blocking will always decrease the damage you take by 50%. Now there are certain types of moves that you can't block. Those are typically going to be damage over times and ground AoEs. You typically won't be able to block those damage. You can typically block anything that is considered a direct damage source that's not a ground AoE. So you'd be able to block something like Flame Clench in PvE, or PvP I should say. You can block something like a boss's heavy attack or mob's heavy attack, because those are considered direct damage sources. So that's pretty much what you'd be able to block. So then there are other sources of mitigation as well. So there's a lot of different places. Let's go over buffs first. So there are a couple of different buffs that will either increase the amount of damage that you are able to mitigate, or decrease the amount of damage that's incoming from the enemy. Those are pretty much considered to be more or less equivalent. So the named buffs for damage reduction, that is, it reduces the damage you take, is protection. So you have major protection and minor protection. Minor protection will increase the damage you're able to mitigate by 8%, so it's an 8% reduction on damage. Major protection is a 30% reduction on damage. And now for the opposite buff, so to speak, is going to be maim. So major maim and minor maim. Minor maim reduces the damage that an enemy can deal by 15%. Major maim will reduce the amount of damage that an enemy can deal by 30%. And now those are all going to be multiplicative with each other. So let's say you have minor maim, and let's say you also have minor protection up. That would be equal to 15 times 8. So if you do the quick math here, it'd be 1 minus, it'd be 0.85 times, and then zero point 0.8, which would be 0.92. And so you'd be able to mitigate about 22% of the damage incoming if you had minor maim and minor protection here. So that's basically how you work things out. So basically you take the percentage, you subtract that from 1, and then you multiply them all together. So let's say you were also blocking, so that'd be 0.5, so you'd be able to mitigate about 60 to 61% of the damage. And let's say you are at resistance cap, so that's another additional 50% reduction, you'd be able to reduce it by 80%. So you can see here that as you get more and more damage mitigation sources, the amount of damage you take becomes less and less and less. Now, because of the way that this equation works, there is no way to achieve 100% damage mitigation. In other words, you will never be able to basically reduce all damage incoming to you, no matter what. So you will eventually top out based on all the different sources of mitigation here. So there are other sources of mitigation as well. So Luna here includes 8% from absorbed magic, so the absorbed magic skill under the one-handed line basically increases the amount of damage you can block by 8%. So you would add in another 8% reduction. So let's say again, you have minor maim, minor protection, you have max resistances, you're blocking. Now you have absorbed magic. So you multiply that by 0.92, and you can see we're now blocking 82% of our damage incoming. 10% from Iron Skin passive, so this is a Dragonite passive that basically increases the amount of damage that you can block. So that is again taken multiplicatively. And then there's a Sword and Board passive that reduces the amount of damage you can block by 20%. So if we take all that into consideration, for instance, so let's say we're doing this assumption here. So we have 50% from blocking. We have 30% coming from our resistances. We have 15% from minor maim, 8% from absorbed magic, 10% from the Iron Skin passive, and 20% from the Sword and Board passive. This would be the entire calculation here. So you can see here we're pretty much multiplying everything together, and this is basically more or less what you can see here. So this entire thing here, and which comes to about 80.3% damage reduction. So if you kind of think about that as as how much damage you take, so Luna is assuming you're taking this much. This is the base damage that you'd be taking. Then you would actually only be taking about 4.6k damage from the original about 23.5k damage. So you can see here that it actually is pretty easy to reduce the damage that's incoming to you, just based on all these different sources and the fact that they all are multiplied on top of each other. Now obviously this is kind of looking at from a DK Knight perspective. So let's say you are a DPS and you have 50% from blocking. DPS don't typically have that many resistances. So let's say you're getting, let's say you're sitting at about let's call it 20% from your resistances. So you're sitting at about 13k resistances or so. You have minor maim from Heroic Slash from the tank. You don't have any sort of minor protection or anything like that. You don't have Absorb Magicka. You don't have the Iron Skin passive. You don't have the 20% from Sword and Board. So you only have from blocking, and you only have the 20% from your resistances and 15% from minor maim. So if we go with the exact same numbers here, so 23,549. So you have minor maim, you're blocking, you're only getting 20% resistances, and you don't have any other source of mitigation. So that's pretty much 15% from minor maim, you have 20% from mitigation from your resistances, you have 50% from blocking. That only reduces damage by 66, so you're mitigating damage by 66%, so if you're taking, so your block, so you would actually only be, hold on, is that right? Sorry, I'd actually have to do that. So you would only be reducing it down to about 7k or so. Now if you were obviously, so this is about a little less than twice as much damage as you would take if you were a tank. So that's something to keep in consideration, that while it is fairly easy to stack sources of mitigation, it really only affects you if you're a tank. If you are a DPS, then realistically you're going to get blocking, you're going to get a little bit from resistances, and minor maim. That's pretty much it. There are going to be some scenarios where you're going to get minor protection, and you might be able to get major maim or major protection, but for the most part, you're only really going to be getting it from blocking, from resistances. You're not getting nearly as much from resistances as you are as a tank, obviously, and 15% from minor maim. So that's pretty much how mitigation works. So pretty much the moral of the story is everything is multiplicative with each other, and the actual equation is 662 resistances is equal to 1% mitigation. However, a lot of people just round down to 660 for ease of calculation. Now, damage shields aren't affected by mitigation at all. Damage shields have 0 resistances. However, they will actually be affected by things like minor maim and major protection and things like that. So, damage shields don't take resistances into consideration, but they will take every other source of damage mitigation into consideration here. So while we're talking about mitigation, we'll also talk about more vulnerabilities, because those two pretty much go hand in hand. Vulnerabilities basically are additive with each other. So let's say you have, for instance, minor vulnerability, and then you have engulfing flames, and you are doing fire damage, then you'd actually be doing 18% more damage with those two combined, because they are additive with each other here. And this also plays, it's the exact same thing in PvP. So for instance, if you are a vampire and you are vulnerable to fire, and you have minor vulnerability on you, and for some reason you got hit by engulfing flames, then it would be, assuming you are a stage 2 vampire or stage 4 vampire, it'd be 75 plus the 8 plus the 10, so you'd be taking pretty much almost 100% additional fire damage. So that's kind of how vulnerabilities work. It's a lot simpler than mitigation. So resistances, we already talked about resistances in our resistance video, so I won't talk to you about that. The one thing that I will mention here is that there are very specific resistances, so flame, frost, and shock, for instance, and those are pretty much always going to be using the exact same values, so 662 or 660 for ease of calculations. So for instance, if you have 660 flame resistance, that is 1% flame resistance, so that reduces your damage taken from flame damage. So now we'll talk about critical resistance here. Critical resistance works pretty differently from physical and spell resistance. So it lowers basically the crit damage modifier instead of just complete damage mitigation. So the base modifier for crit damage is going to be an additional 50% additional damage, and so that can be increased by CP buffs, by minor force and major force, and things like that. This is subtractive, so it's not multiplicative, it's going to be subtractive. So if you see here, you're subtracting your crit resistance divided by 68 divided by 100. So in this case, 68 critical resistance is equal to 1% damage mitigation. So basically what happens is your crit modifier, or the amount of damage that you'd be taking from a crit, let's say you are in PvP and somebody has, let's say, 15% additional crit damage from their CP passives, and they are a Templar, so they get additional 10%. So it'd be 1.5 plus the 10%, so 1.6 from the Templar passive, plus the 15% from CP. So now they're hitting you for 1.75. And now let's say you have 680 critical resistance. That would be equivalent to 10% reduction. So instead of 1.75 times the original damage, you'd be taking 1.65, the amount of damage that you would be taking from that critical hit. So this is kind of what Luna's equation is. If you have 100 points into resistance and have 1650 crit resistance, this actually ends up, and the player that you're getting hit by doesn't have any sort of modifiers, you'd be taking 1.26 times the original damage on a critical hit. Now, crit resistance doesn't have a hard cap, so they mention here that there is no critical resistance hard cap. So the max resistance is, however, 110%, and the highest possible crit damage modifier is 115%. So so they mention that there isn't even enough critical resistance to justify having that much crit resistance. So that's that's how critical resistance works in PvP. So it's basically a subtractive modifier onto the damage buff, and 68 critical resistance equal to a 1% reduction in that crit buff. So 10% crit resistance, crit damage reduction would be equal to 680 crit resistance, and that's subtracted directly from the crit damage modifier. Now I do want to mention Guard here. So Guard is a Alliance War support ability that sometimes tanks and healers will use, and basically what that does is whoever that a person is guarding, so let's say I'm guarding my DPS, if my DPS takes damage, then I will be take 30% of that damage. So basically what it happens here is that they basically get a 30% damage mitigation, and that amount is basically given to me in terms of damage. Now, that damage is also mitigated from my mitigation. So let's say that that 30% damage that they would be taking is 3k. Then when I take that 3k damage, it's actually reduced by my own mitigation. So when a tank is guarding a DPS, the 30% additional damage that a DPS is taking is mitigated even further by my own personal mitigation as a tank. So basically, in other words, you're basically calculating your mitigation twice if you're using guard. So in that scenario, a lot of the times, the damage that you're actually taking if you're guarding, regardless if you're a tank or a healer, is actually going to be fairly low. So, you know, let's say you have that 33% reduction here. So you have, you know, you would be taking. So this is the damage that the DPS would be taking here. So 77, 71. So you take 30% of that. So you would be taking this much normally. However, if you have the same amount of resistances, so you're mitigating 66% of the damage, 0.33, you would only actually be taking a little less than 800 damage. So it's actually not that bad in guarding somebody. Now, a lot of people have been, you know, pointing out that healers are guarding their ranged DPS, and how come the healers aren't dying? That's because mitigation double dips when you're using guard. So now, if your ally is using a damage shield, that's going to be pretty complicated to say the least. So because damage shields don't have any sort of resistances at all, but they will be affected by damage mitigation. So here's what Luna says. It reduces the damage taken by the caster by about 57.1% of the ally's damage shield strength. So if the targeted ally takes 10,000 damage but uses a 5,000 damage shield, the caster will take 855 damage. And it's just so they're basically saying that it's going to be 10k times the mitigation, the guard. So you're taking that 30% of 10,000, and then you're subtracting out the damage shield times whatever your mitigation is. And so there's no reason why it makes sense this way, because it's just the way that Zos decided to have it calculated. It doesn't make any sense to me, but that's how it ends up working. So that is. Oh, and by the way, Luna does include a damage mitigation calculator here. If you go ahead and click on it right here, basically it says what's the damage, do you have a damage shield, what's your race, what type of damage is it, what's your resistance is, how many points do you have into hardy, or rather what the percentage is in hardy, the type of damage, if you're blocking, how many points you have into ironclad, which affects direct damage taken, you know, which scenario you're in, and all these different sort of things here. And basically allows you to figure out how much damage you would actually be taking based on the amount of damage here. So this is a really useful tool if you kind of want to see what sort of damage you'd end up taking in games. I will have a link in this down in the description below. So that is it for this video. Hope you guys found it informative, and I will see you guys in the next dungeon.